Thanks for attending my presentation. Today I talk about my first PhD chapter, which focuses on the long-term effects of fire on ants. My work focuses on tropical savannas, which cover a large part of Australia. Not only are these ecosystems extensive, but they also host a rich biodiversity. And one thing that characterizes tropical savannas is fire. Indeed, as you can see on this map, where color indicate locations that burn between 2000 and 2017, there's a large part of Australian savannas that burn frequently. And these frequent fires makes it important to better understand what are the effects of these disturbances on biodiversity. For now, there is still no consensus on exactly how fire affects fauna. In particular, we need more research looking at the long-term effects of fire on their biodiversity. That's why, during my PhD, I'm using ants to better understand the effects of fire on biodiversity. At this point, you might wonder, but why use ants? Well, they're great because they're abundant, ubiquitous, they're species rich, and they also serve ecosystem functions. And that makes ants a model taxon to test hypotheses on how biodiversity relates to faunal diversity. Thus, using ants, my first chapter aims to establish what are the longer-term effects of different fire frequency on ground-dwelling ants, and to quantify how their responses vary through time. To do that, I'm using data gathered at the Territory Wildlife Park fire experiments, where plots get burned at different fire frequencies, from being unburnt to being burnt every year. So after almost 20 years of burning, the differences between the plots can be quite drastic. So these photos show two plots next to each other. The one on the left is annually burnt and the one on the right is unburned. And you can easily notice how their vegetation differs. So the fire experiment started in 2003 and ants have been collected over the years since the start of the experiment. The final data that I'm going to use will cover over 18 years of sampling and include 4,590 pitfall traps. But today, what I'm presenting is data that starts at the beginning of the experiment all the way to 2015. So far, there's two studies that looked into the effects of fire at the wildlife park. The first one focused on the short-term effects of fire, and basically, they found that there was no response. So there was no differences between the richness, composition, and abundance of ant species between different fire regimes. However, after 5 years of experimental burning, there's a second study that found that ants actually had a response. So there was differences in abundance, composition, and richness between highly contrasting fire regimes. So for now, I've compiled data up until 2015, and which is one additional time period compared to previous studies. And my prediction is that contrasting fire regimes, high and low fire frequency, will differ in richness and abundance more as time goes on. And so this is kind of what these plots are showing. So on the x-axis of both plots, you've got time, which increases from left to right. And then on the y-axis, on the left, you have richness and abundance on the right. And you can see that initially there's not much differences in richness nor abundance, but as time goes on, these start to differ between the high and low fire frequency regimes.
There also appears to be an increase in species composition variation between high and low fire frequency plots. So these ordinations represent the species compositions of the ant communities of different fire plots, shown as points. The red color represents high fire frequency regimes, whereas the yellow represents the low fire frequency regimes. And in these ordinations, overlapping ellipses mean that species compositions are similar, whereas non-overlapping ellipses indicate that fire regimes have different species composition. So what we can learn from these two ordinations is that early on, as shown on the left, species communities are similar between different fire regimes. And that's because the ellipses shown there are almost right on top of each other. But then after years of burning, they start to differ. So on the right, you can see that the ellipses are becoming independent, and there's now a difference in the species composition between the different fire regimes.
Similarly, my preliminary analysis showed that initially there's no clear indicator species between fire regimes, but after years of burning, low fire frequency plots have forest-adapted species, and high fire frequency plots have fire-adapted ants. These preliminary results matter because they show that the short-term effects of fire differ from the long-term effects. Thus, it's crucial to establish long-term experiments to elucidate the true effects of fire on fauna. So thank you so much for listening, and I look forward to your questions.